They called him Il Capitano, the gentleman in black and blue. A left back who ran like a winger, who lifted his head not to clear his lines but to choose a pass as if the entire pitch were a chessboard he'd already solved. He redefined what a defender could be, then quietly paid the cost of being better than his time. Picture San Siro under winter lights, breath hanging in the air, a number 3 streaking down the touchline, long stride devouring grass, cross already shaped in his mind before the ball even kissed his boot. Banners tremble, the curva roars, and somewhere between steel and silk, Giacinto Facchetti turns defense into destiny. He plays with a kind of moral clarity, no theatrics, no snarling, just a captain's gaze that says, "Follow me," and they do. 2 European crowns, the world at Inter's feet, Italy dreaming with him as its standard bearer. But every empire carries its cracks. After the glory came a quiet ache, the gutting losses that close eras, the weight of a nation's disappointment, the suspicion that you can lead impeccably and still be led into storms you never chose. Years later, when he could no longer answer back, whispers would rise from the shadows of Italian football, the kind born in wiretaps and grievance, pointing at his name as if purity itself could be put on trial. The gentleman dragged into a mud fight he did not live to see. So here is our question. How does a man so elegant, so disciplined, so impossibly modern for his position, become a battleground for the sport's oldest contradictions, beauty and cynicism, pride and doubt, the victory and the price it demands? This is not merely a career. It is the story of a standard, of a defender who became an idea, and of the day that idea was asked to defend itself. To understand Giacinto Facchetti is to walk the line between 2 Italis, the post-war nation still searching for its soul, and the footballing empire rising from rubble into triumph. He was born in 1942-inch Treviglio, a quiet Lombard town, as the world burned around him. When he laced up his first boots, Italy was licking its wounds from fascism and war. By the time he hung them up, he had helped redefine the image of the Italian footballer, no longer just catenaccio and cynicism, but grace, power, and moral force. Facchetti emerged in an age where defenders were brick walls functional, punishing, often invisible. But in the early 1962nd, as Inter Milan became the crucible of tactical innovation under Helenio Herrera, Facchetti became the mold breaker. He had the stride of a gazelle and the brain of a playmaker. Herrera saw it first. This tall, soft-spoken fullback could do more than mark and tackle. He could surge forward like a wave breaking lines. The result? A revolution. At Inter, he wasn't just part of Le Grand Inter, he was its spirit. That team, champions of Europe in 1964 and 1965, was a calculated machine. And yet, Facchetti added the poetry. While others shut down attacks, he created them. He scored 10 goals in the 1965-66 season, still a record for a defender in Serie A. This was unheard of. Defenders didn't score, they didn't dribble, they didn't lead from the front. Facchetti did all 3. He wore the captain's armband, not like a badge of war, but a contract of trust. He wasn't feared, he was followed. Internationally, he carried Italy through a generation of both renaissance and regret. He captained the Azzurri to their first European Championship win in 1968 and led them to the World Cup final in 1970, falling only to Pelé's Brazil in what many call the greatest team of all time. But that era, despite its promise, would never yield another major trophy in his playing days. He would retire with 94 caps and a sense of having almost touched immortality. Yet beyond the pitch, something more unusual was unfolding. Facchetti was beloved by everyone. Teammates, referees, journalists, even rivals spoke of him with the same reverence. In a sport often painted in shades of betrayal and backroom deals, he was the rare man about whom no one seemed to whisper, at least not yet. And perhaps that's what makes what came later so jarring. Because this was not just a player of elegance, this was a symbol. Inter Milan eventually retired his number 3. FIFA included him in their list of the 100 greatest living players. He served as vice president, then president of Inter Milan. He was even discussed as a future figurehead for Italian football at the national level. His clean image was almost sacred, which is exactly why the scandal that surfaced years after his death felt so corrosive. It wasn't just about alleged phone calls or impropriety, it was about whether the game had been honest with us, about one of its purest figures. Was it all true? Had the gentleman captain compromised himself? Or had the system, corrupted and bitter, tried to drag one of its only saints into the muck? Facchetti by then was no longer here to answer. He had died of cancer in 2006, mourned like royalty. But death, in football, is not always the end. Sometimes it's just the beginning of a second trial, one played in courtrooms, headlines, and the memory of fans who thought they knew the man behind the armband. When Giacinto Facchetti stepped onto the pitch in 1960 for his Inter Milan debut, he wasn't merely a young defender eager to prove himself. He was the quiet start of a storm that would change Italian football forever. Under Helenio Herrera's iron discipline and tactical genius, Facchetti found the perfect platform. Inter was transforming into a machine, disciplined, cold, terrifying. But in Facchetti, they had a man who softened the machine with grace. The rise was meteoric. By 1963, he was a starter. By 1965, a European champion. By 1966, the most feared attacking fullback in the world. He moved with unnatural fluidity, long limbs slicing through midfield with balletic control. His 10 goals in the 1965-66 season weren't just a statistic, they were a message. Defenders could decide games, and they could do so beautifully. But greatness demands more than skill, it needs character. In an era when Italian football was hard, violent, often morally murky, Facchetti stood out like a fresco on a prison wall. He rarely fouled, he never complained, and for nearly 2 decades, he led with a calm authority that made even his silences feel weighty. To Inter fans, he wasn't just a captain, he was a compass. And yet, the fall was inevitable, not because he faltered, but because time does not spare even the noble. After the golden years of the mid-62nd, Inter began to fade. The 1967 European Cup final, lost to Celtic, was a wound that never quite healed. Italy's shocking group stage exit in the 1966 World Cup cut even deeper. Facchetti had been captain in both. Though he remained dignified, the weight of failure clung to him like smoke. By the 1970 World Cup, Italy seemed ready for redemption, and for a time, they danced again. The semifinal against West Germany, still called the Game of the Century, was a test of will and endurance. Facchetti led every extra-time charge, legs burning, heart wide open. They reached the final, only to be torn apart by Brazil. It was a defeat so poetic it almost felt scripted. Beauty, devouring beauty. As he aged, Inter staggered into inconsistency. New stars rose, Bonensegna, Mazzola matured, but the golden aura dimmed. Facchetti stayed loyal, the last pillar of an empire crumbling around him. By 1978, his legs gave way before his spirit did. He retired quietly. No farewell tour, no last-minute glory. Just a man walking off the stage with the same elegance he had shown while playing. But if the story had ended there, it would have remained pristine. A myth sealed in marble. Instead, he stepped back into the game not as a coach but as a director. Eventually, he became vice president of Inter, and in 2004, its president. He was seen as a stabilizing force, a gentleman among sharks. While other clubs waded into scandal, Inter under Facchetti was seen as above the fray. Until they weren't. In 2006, Facchetti died of pancreatic cancer. Italy mourned. The tributes were universal, emotional, and genuine. The football world believed it had lost one of its rarest sons, talented, noble, incorruptible. But barely months later, as the Calciopoli scandal exploded across Italy, something sinister began to stir. Wiretaps, accusations, names, and then, the unthinkable. Facchetti's name appeared. Not as a victim, but as a potential player in the very system he was believed to stand against. It wasn't just a fall, it was a question mark, slammed down on the legacy of a saint. He was dead. That should have been the end of the story. A quiet funeral, an avalanche of tributes, shirts lifted in his honor, moments of silence stretching like sacred hymns across stadiums. But for Giacinto Facchetti, death was only the beginning of the most painful chapter, the one he could no longer defend himself in. In 2006, just weeks after Facchetti's passing, the Calciopoli scandal erupted a firestorm of wiretaps, criminal charges, point deductions, and league titles reassigned. It was a moment that ripped open the underbelly of Italian football. Juventus was stripped of its Scudetti. FIGC officials fell like dominoes. But amidst the chaos, whispers began to emerge, not about what Facchetti had done while alive, but about what his phone might have recorded. Wiretapped conversations, dozens of them, phone calls between Inter's executives and refereeing officials. Some dated back to the early 2002, when Facchetti was vice president and, later, president of Inter. Prosecutor Stefano Palazzi, tasked with investigating the extended scope of Calciopoli, dropped a bombshell in 2011. He accused Giacinto Facchetti of violating Article 1 of the FIGC's Code of Sporting Justice, essentially alleging unethical behavior in seeking to influence referee assignments. But this was no ordinary accusation. This was Facchetti, the gentleman, the saint, the moral compass of Italian football. He had never been shown a red card. He had signed autographs for children and shaken hands with referees even in defeat. He was the symbol of clean play. And now, his name was in the same breath as Maggi, Giraudo, and the rest of the tainted elite. The details were murky. There was no direct evidence of bribery, no money exchanged, no orders barked down phone lines. What there was, according to prosecutors, was a pattern, calls where Facchetti seemed to be too friendly with referee designators, too proactive, too political. Some transcripts suggested he asked about referees in upcoming games. Others hinted at praise or criticism after matches. In the toxic climate of post-Calciopoli Italy, that was enough. The Inter community erupted in disbelief. Former players, fans, and officials closed ranks. He cannot defend himself, they said. Let the dead rest. Massimo Moratti, then owner of Inter and one of Facchetti's closest friends, described the accusations as an indecent attack on a man who represented the highest values of this sport. But others weren't so forgiving. Juventus fans, bitter from their club's punishment, turned Facchetti into a symbol of hypocrisy. Online forums, editorials, even stadium chants accused Inter of hiding behind a dead man. It wasn't justice, it was vengeance disguised as revelation. Facchetti's family, especially his son Gianfelice, was shattered. In interviews, he defended his father with quiet fury. He never asked for favors, he never played games. He was transparent because that's who he was. They waited for him to die to speak this way. And maybe that's the hardest part. The accusations came not in a court of law, but in the court of public opinion. With Facchetti gone, the lines between truth and vendetta blurred into fog. The psychological wound left by the scandal was deep. Inter had just won the treble in 2010 under Mourinho, and for a brief moment, it seemed like a new golden era, but the shadows came back. Fans began to ask, was it built on something rotten? Could Facchetti have been part of the same machinery he publicly despised? And yet, not a single official charge was ever brought. The statute of limitations had expired. The accusations hung like smoke in the rafters, visible, toxic, but untouchable. The media eventually moved on. But something had broken. Not just in Facchetti's legacy, but in the myth of incorruptibility that fans clung to. If even he wasn't safe from suspicion, who was? Perhaps the most tragic detail is this. Facchetti died believing he had served football with honor, that he had lifted the game by the shoulders and carried it across decades of doubt and darkness. And now, his name was being dissected like a suspect's anatomeme, not by those who knew him best, but by those who never had to look him in the eye. In the end, it wasn't a red card, a missed penalty, or a botched tackle that threatened his legacy. It was the possibility never proven, never erased, that even the brightest light might cast a shadow. There are stories in football that ask for your judgment. Others ask only for your silence. The story of Giacinto Facchetti demands both. Because how do you weigh a lifetime of elegance against a handful of transcripts? How do you reconcile the towering image of a man who captained with dignity, played with integrity, and died with universal respect with the cold, ambiguous language of wiretaps he never got to explain? On one hand, the facts are there, etched in Calciopoli's massive wreckage. Yes, Facchetti made phone calls. Yes, he had conversations with referee designators. Yes, some believe it crossed an ethical line. But here's the truth. Everyone in Italian football did. The entire system was built on proximity, influence, and whispers behind closed doors. To exist within it was to play a game far beyond the pitch. And yet, he was supposed to be different. Facchetti wasn't like the others. He didn't swagger or scream. He didn't threaten referees or dictate press narratives. He led by example through posture, not politics. He was the man who offered his hand first, the captain whose legacy was supposed to be above reproach. So was he guilty? We don't know. And that's the haunting part. We never will, because he died before he could speak. And in that silence, people projected what they wanted: justice, revenge, clarity. Some saw betrayal, others saw scapegoating. The man was gone. The myth was vulnerable. What we do know is this. If Giacinto Facchetti made mistakes, he made them in a world where morality was currency, traded and devalued every weekend. If he played a part in the theater of influence, he did so with a script already written by those before him. And if his name now echoes in controversy, it says less about his character than about the decay that surrounded him. So ask yourself this. Was Giacinto Facchetti a fallen idol or a man too noble to survive in a game that had forgotten how to honor nobility? Did we lose a saint to corruption, or did the corrupted need to drag him down to silence their own guilt? This channel does not pretend to have the answers. But we believe this. Legacy is not built in wiretaps. It's built in decades of matches played without shame, in teammates who still speak his name with tears, in clubs that retired his number, not because of marketing, but because they could never replace what he stood for. Facchetti may have been human, maybe even flawed. But in a world that has seen too many villains in suits pretending to be saints, he may have been the rare saint accused of villainy because the truth was too painful to accept. That such goodness was possible once. There's a quiet that falls over the San Siro before kickoff, a stillness that holds the ghosts of giants. Among them, Giacinto Facchetti still walks, not as a scandal, not as a whisper from a phone line, but as a figure cut from another cloth. Number 3, tall and graceful, striding down the touchline as if the field itself owed him reverence. He's gone now, nearly 2 decades, but his memory lingers like a hymn. Every child who dreams of wearing the armband for Inter carries a little piece of him. Every modern fullback who dares to attack, to create, to lead, not just defend, is following in his footsteps, whether they know it or not. Long before the world hailed Roberto Carlos or Marcelo, there was Facchetti quietly reshaping the geometry of the game. But his legacy is more than just positional evolution. It's about how he played, with honor, with respect, with an elegance that refused to get dirty, even when the game around him begged for it. In a sport increasingly defined by outrage, simulation, and vitriol, Facchetti was a man who never needed to shout to be heard. The stain of suspicion will always linger in some corners. That's the burden of being remembered. Not everyone remembers the same way. But even those who doubted the man never questioned the player. And those who knew him really knew him. Defend his name not with blind loyalty, but with stories. Stories of grace under pressure, of humility in triumph, of integrity that felt unshakable. Inter Milan retired his number. The club's Hall of Fame begins with his name. Streets in Italy bear his memory. But perhaps the most fitting tribute comes from fans who never saw him play, yet speak of him with the reverence usually reserved for poets and philosophers. Because Facchetti wasn't just a footballer, he was a kind of idea, The kind we mourn not just when a man dies, but when the world forgets how to be that kind of man. He's not here to defend himself, but maybe he doesn't need to. Because every time someone takes the field and chooses dignity over deception, class over chaos, leadership over loudness, Giacinto Facchetti lives again. Some legends never needed to shout, and that's why we still hear him.